Technology in the Revolutionary War. In 1607, Britain came to colonize the Americas. Flash forward 150 years to 1765, Britain was imposing stricter and stricter taxes. America opposed because they felt they weren't being represented, so they organized against the British law and created the Declaration of Independence. Unwilling to let them go, Britain sent their army to prevent losing control.
During the war, the main mode of transportation was ships. Ships were used to deliver supplies, to spy on each other, and for many naval battles. During this time was the invention of the submarine. In 1775, David Bushnell, who studied underwater explosives at Yale, built the submarine as a reliable method for detonating underwater explosives, a clockwork connected to a musket firing mechanism, probably a flintlock, adapted for the purpose. He built this with Dr. Isaac Doolittle, who was a clockmaker and manufacturer in New Haven. Destroying the symbol of British naval power by means of a submarine would at least be a blow to British morale, and perhaps threaten the British blockade and control of the New York harbor. The British had controls of many harbors along the East Coast, and the submarine was a crucial tactic in order to win the war. They could use it to spy on the British and against British occupying. The name of the submarine was the Turtle. George Washington doubted this method, but he provided funding, and it turned out to be a big success.
The American Revolutionary War took place at a fascinating time because a variety of both archaic, out-of-date, and modern state-of-the-art weapons played a huge part in the war and would coexist on the same battlefield. Notable American firearms included the Brown Bess, Charville musket, long rifles, and the bayonet. It is important to note that none of these firearms actually used the modern bullets of today, but instead used iron and musket balls. Besides that, all the firearms had slow rates of fire, a difficult reloading process, and a maximum range of 300 yards for some long-range muskets. Many of these guns were recent American designs of the 18th century, and this was the first time that they were being put to actual use on the battlefield. The British notable infantry weapons included the Pattern 1776 infantry rifle, Ferguson rifle, and Brown Bess musket. Interestingly, the Ferguson rifle had a much faster fire rate than many American muskets, but the cost was quite high and had a maximum range of about 100 yards only. In addition to firearms, both the Americans and British made use of various other weapons, including knives, axes, swords, and specifically for Americans, due to their Native American influence, an occasional tomahawk. These were all weapons which had been used throughout history, and the basic science behind them is self-explanatory. Both sides also made use over a slew of artillery devices, including cannons, mortars, and howitzers. During the American Revolutionary War, the three devices launched a projectile using gunpowder instead of smokeless powder, which was invented in the 19th century. Both sides were quite even when it came to their weapons. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, a total of 6,800 U.S. soldiers and a total of 9,372 British soldiers were killed in battle. While nowhere near the astronomical casualties which came in many wars before and would come in many wars after, the fatalities in this war were certainly increased and impacted by the recently developed technological weaponry advances.
Were the technological advancements lopsided? Overall, many historians argue that both the British and the Americans were at a draw when it came to their weaponry. While Americans used more accurate and lighter rifles, the British maintained better and wider stock of their weapons. But when it came to communication, the American spy network, their knowledge of the landscape, and their use of music all gave the Americans the upper hand technologically. In terms of medicine, the United States also had better technology because Washington had his soldiers inoculated with vaccines, resulting in far fewer deaths due to disease in comparison to the British.
Medicine in the Revolutionary War. The most common diseases were yellow fever, smallpox, and malaria. The medical tools that were most often used were a grooved forceps to remove bullets, amputation saws, scalpels used in surgery, and lancets used to draw blood and remove abscesses. Research shows that soldiers had a 98% chance of survival on the battlefield, yet only a 75% chance of survival rate in hospitals. Hospitals were made of tents with single tables. Supplies were extremely sparse, and doctors had very little training. Doctors used opiates as painkillers, and anesthetics were not yet invented. There was very little sanitation, and soldiers usually ended up getting limbs amputated or even dying because of infections caused within the hospitals. Music was the main form of communication during the war. Most musicians were boys that were too young to fight in the war, mainly consisting of males younger than 16 or older than 50. A fife had a high-pitched sound, and a drum had a low sound. Drummers would play rhythms that told the soldiers to turn right or turn left or to load their muskets on the battlefield. They could also tell soldiers the jobs that needed to be done around camps, when meal times were, and what time to wake up. Bugles were used by riders on horseback because they could be used with only one hand. Lanterns and torches played a huge part in the Revolutionary War, especially pertaining to Paul Revere's ride on horseback from Boston to Concord. Revere planned a form of communication with some of his fellow patriots in case the British troops began advancing towards Concord. One lantern meant the British chose the longer route, and 2 lanterns meant they chose the shorter route, leaving less time for the patriots to prepare. Signal fires were meant to call out the militia, to indicate the approach direction of the British, and to direct the subsequent movements of the militia.
Since overall the Americans had better technology than the British when it came to communication and medicine, it allowed the American forces to regroup more effectively, and it ultimately led to their victory and independence from the British Empire. As a result of American victory, the United States was no longer a British colony. This meant that they now had vast opportunities for free trade, as well as manufacturing. This signified the end of mercantilism and would eventually lead the United States to become a dominant world power, both politically and technologically. This can be seen directly after the Revolutionary War and the American Indian Wars, where they used their experiences from the previous war to give them the technological upper hand and continued to assert their dominance.